The barren alien queen had given up until a human showed her what hope really means. The vast palace of Ivra glowed under a violet sky, its crystal spires humming softly with alien energy. Inside, the throne room was silent, the air thick with the scent of fading flowers, offerings meant to honor the queen who had not smiled in decades. Queen Sarathia of the Solran Empire sat alone, her golden crown resting heavily upon her head, her gaze lost in the void beyond the glass walls. Her people were born from light, their blood shimmering like liquid starlight. For centuries, their race had been known as creators, architects of galaxies, the mothers of civilizations. But something had changed. For generations now, no child had been born among them. Their wombs had turned to dust, and their once living cities had grown quiet. The curse had started with her. Sarathia had once been promised to bear 100 heirs, each a spark of new creation. But time passed, and her body refused to bring forth life. Priests whispered that the gods had turned away. The council had stopped speaking her name in reverence and now spoke it only in fear. She stood from her throne, walking toward the great mirror that stretched from floor to ceiling. Her reflection stared back, tall, regal, with skin like molten silver and eyes that glowed faintly blue. But beneath that beauty lay emptiness. Her heart pulsed slowly, heavy with grief. She had tried everything. The healers of the twin suns, the ancient rituals of fertility, even the forbidden science of merging essence with other species. Nothing worked. Each attempt left her weaker, emptier. Now, her empire drifted toward collapse, and her people whispered about replacing her with someone younger, someone who could give them a future. Outside the palace walls, warships rusted in orbit. Colonies stopped sending tribute. Her subjects began leaving the homeworld, searching for new destinies among the stars. The once living pulse of the Solran race was fading. That night, as storms of glass rained from the purple clouds, Sarathia walked alone to the edge of her garden, a dying forest encased in crystal. The trees no longer grew, their leaves brittle and white like bone. She knelt before one, resting her hand on its cold bark. "I have failed you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Perhaps the gods are right. Perhaps this universe has no place left for life born of light." The wind shifted. From the corner of her eye she saw movement, a flash of something foreign. Metal. A ship. It descended through the storm, battered and small, clearly not one of her people's vessels. It crashed beyond the hills, sending a tremor through the ground. For a brief moment, the dying trees flickered with faint luminescence as though remembering the feeling of life. Sarathia rose slowly, her heart tightening. No ships had entered this system in years. The surrounding sectors had been sealed, forbidden by her own decree. Who would dare to enter a dead empire? She summoned her guards, but none answered. The palace halls were deserted. Her attendants had long stopped caring for her commands, so she went alone. The journey across the wasteland was silent, broken only by the crunch of glass beneath her feet. The night stretched long, and her robes shimmered faintly in the darkness. When she reached the crash site, smoke billowed into the air, thick and black. Through the haze, she saw a figure crawling from the wreckage, a human. He was wounded, blood streaking across his face, his suit torn by shards of metal. He looked fragile, painfully small against the massive wreck behind him. She had seen humans once long ago during the Great Concord, when their kind was still rising from their primitive wars. They were impulsive, reckless, emotional creatures, but now before her one was breathing, alive, defiant, even in ruin. He noticed her presence and froze. His hand reached for a weapon, but his strength failed him. He fell forward, gasping for air. Sarathia approached cautiously. "You should not be here," she said, her voice echoing softly in the empty valley. The human turned his head toward her. His lips were dry, his breathing shallow. "Then, maybe I came to the right place," he murmured before losing consciousness. For a long moment she stood over him, unsure why she did not let him die. He was nothing to her, a remnant of a reckless race. Yet as she looked upon his frail form, something stirred in her chest, something she had not felt in centuries. A pulse, a warmth. She lifted him gently, her hands glowing faintly as she carried him back to the palace. The storm roared around them, but for the first time in a long while she did not care. Inside the throne hall, she laid him upon the marble floor. Her servants watched from the shadows but did not interfere. They thought she had gone mad. "Prepare the healing chamber," she commanded softly, "and bring him nourishment." They hesitated, but the ancient power in her voice made them obey. When the human's eyes opened hours later, he found himself beneath a canopy of light. The queen sat beside him, silent, watching. He looked at her, at the beauty and sorrow in her gaze, and whispered, "You saved me." "Why?" Sarathia did not answer. She only turned her eyes toward the dying horizon, where dawn never came anymore. In that quiet moment, the Barren queen felt something unfamiliar, a fragile spark, a memory of what it was to hope, and she did not know it yet. But the arrival of that broken human would change the fate of her entire dying race. The human awoke again several hours later. His breath steadier now, though pain still lingered across his body. He turned his head slowly and found himself surrounded by pillars of light. Floating runes and strange golden patterns etched into the floor. It felt less like a room and more like a living cathedral. Queen Sarathia stood near the edge of the chamber, her long silver hair cascading down like liquid moonlight. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dimness, watching him with quiet curiosity. The silence between them was sharp, filled with questions neither knew how to ask. "You are human," she said finally, her tone calm but heavy with authority. "From what world?" The man struggled to sit up, his voice hoarse. "Name's Elias, pilot, or was." He gave a weak laugh that quickly turned into a cough. "Ship didn't like your sky much." Her expression did not change, but her eyes studied him closely. "You came through a sealed system. No one enters this place." Elias looked around the luminous room. "Then maybe I was meant to." Sarathia tilted her head slightly, sensing the strange confidence in his tone. "No fear, no reverence. Just a quiet stubbornness, something humans were famous for." "You are far from home, Elias," she said, "and this world holds no life worth finding." He looked toward her with a faint smile. "Then maybe that's why I'm here. To remind you what life still looks like." The queen turned away. The words unsettled her. For years her people had stopped believing in rebirth and renewal. Even their prayers had become hollow. Yet this fragile creature, broken and lost, spoke as though hope was a living thing that followed him wherever he went. She ordered her servants to feed him. They hesitated, whispering among themselves about the human's presence. To them he was an omen, either salvation or the final curse. Days passed. Elias healed slowly, wandering through the crystal halls studying their architecture. He spoke often, asking questions no one dared to ask the queen. Why was the palace so empty? Why were the gardens dead? Why did her people look at her with fear instead of love? Sarathia found herself answering, at first briefly, then with unexpected honesty. She told him of the great silence that fell upon their species, of how her body, once blessed by the stars, could no longer bring life, of how every attempt to restore fertility failed. Her words were distant, as though she had told the story too many times to still feel it. Elias listened quietly, then said something she did not expect. "Maybe life doesn't always start the way you think. Maybe it needs something different." "Different?" she asked. "Something wild," he said with a small grin. "Something unpredictable." Like us, she studied him, confused. "You think chaos is the answer to death?" "I think hope usually comes dressed as chaos," he said. That night, Sarathia could not sleep. She stood again in her glass garden, the stars reflecting in her eyes. The human's words echoed in her mind, not because they were wise, but because they were alive. He spoke as if death was only a delay, not an ending. The next morning, she found him working near the edge of the garden. He had stripped part of his ship for tools and was digging into the ground. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Planting," he said simply. "Found some seeds in my emergency rations. Not much, but maybe they'll take root here." Her eyes narrowed. "Nothing grows here. The soil is dead." "Maybe," he said, pressing the last seed into the dust. "It just needs to be reminded how to live." She almost laughed, a sound she had not made in decades. "You are foolish." "I get that a lot," he replied. Over the next few days, she watched him water the patch of lifeless soil with melted ice, humming quietly to himself as though the ground could hear. Each time she passed, she told herself it was pointless, yet she kept returning. On the 7th day, something impossible happened. A thin green sprout broke through the gray dust. Small, trembling, but undeniably alive. Sarathia froze. The air around her felt electric. She knelt beside the fragile stem, her fingers trembling as she touched it. The warmth beneath her skin pulsed in rhythm with the tiny life. "How?" she whispered. Elias smiled. "You told me everything here was dead. I just refused to believe it." For a moment she said nothing. Then her voice softened. "In all the years of my reign I have not seen such a thing. It's just a plant," he said. "But it's a start." She looked at him, really looked. The human who had fallen from the sky, who should have died, had somehow made life appear where the gods themselves had failed. It was small, fragile, yet more beautiful than any monument her people had ever built. That night the queen stood once more before her mirror. For the first time in centuries she saw something new in her reflection. Light. Not the cold, artificial glow of her power, but the quiet spark of wonder. Elias's presence had begun to shift something within her empire. The servants whispered of the green sprout, of the queen who smiled again, but not all saw it as hope. Some called it corruption. Far beyond the palace, the high priests of the old faith gathered in silence, their eyes burning with distrust. They saw the human's influence spreading like disease. To them he was not a savior. He was the infection that would destroy what little sanctity their dying world still possessed. And while Sarathia slept, dreaming of new life, they prepared to end the hope that had just begun to breathe. The priests gathered beneath the Cathedral of Light, where the oldest fire of the Solran still burned weakly, flickering like a dying heartbeat. Their robes shimmered in hues of fading gold, and their faces were hidden behind mirrored masks that reflected nothing but emptiness. For centuries they had served as keepers of tradition, guardians of divine law, but now they spoke with fear. "The queen has brought an outsider," one hissed, his voice sharp as broken glass. "A creature of chaos born of flesh and imperfection. He meddles with our soil," another whispered. "And life has returned where there should be none. The balance has been disturbed." They turned their masked faces toward the high priest, a tall and ancient being with hollow eyes that glowed faintly white. His voice was calm, yet heavy with conviction. "This is not rebirth. It is corruption. The human brings decay masked as hope. If he remains, he will unmake what little sanctity remains of our kind." Their decision was unanimous. The human would die before his disease of emotion could spread any further. Meanwhile, in the upper palace, Sarathia stood once more beside the small plant that had grown from the dead soil. Its leaves now shimmered faintly green, a color her world had forgotten. Elias knelt beside it, his hands coated in dirt, his expression proud but peaceful. "You keep staring at it," he said, smiling up at her. "You'd think you'd never seen a plant before." "I have," she replied softly, "but never one that wanted to live." Elias wiped his hands, glancing at her. "Everything wants to live, Sarathia, even if it forgets how." She turned her gaze toward the dying horizon, the stars barely visible through the eternal mist. "You speak as if death is only a dream," he chuckled. "Maybe it is. Maybe the universe just needs a reason to wake up again." Something in his words unsettled her. Humans, she realized, had a way of speaking truth as if it were a story. Not logical, not sacred, but felt. And though she had ruled for over 6,000 cycles, she found herself listening to him as if she were the student, not the queen. In the following days, Elias began exploring the outskirts of the palace with her reluctant permission. He mapped the lands, studied the storms, and examined the crystals that covered the soil. "These crystals," he said once, holding one in his hand, "are feeding on your world's energy. They're like parasites," she frowned. "They are sacred remnants of our light. We have always believed they protect us. Maybe once they did," he said. "But look at them now. They're draining your air, your soil, even your people. Everything that glows here is dying slower than it should." She was silent. His words burned like acid in her mind. Could it be true? Could the light she had worshipped for centuries be the very thing killing them? That night she walked alone into the ancient archives beneath the palace. The texts written by her ancestors were preserved in living glass, whispering softly when touched. She searched for any mention of decay, of imbalance, of humans. She found a single phrase etched in a forgotten dialect. "When the light grows cold, seek warmth from beyond the stars." Her hand trembled as she traced the words. It could not be coincidence. But even as she began to understand, shadows were already moving against her. The priests sent assassins to the palace, their bodies wrapped in veils of invisible energy. They entered silently, passing through walls like ghosts. Their task was simple: end the human's life before dawn. Elias was sleeping in the garden near the small plant he had grown. He woke to the faint shimmer of movement, a feeling of wrongness in the air. He rolled aside just as a blade of light sliced into the ground where his head had been. The assassin struck without sound. He scrambled for a broken metal rod from his wrecked ship, deflecting one strike, then another. But they were faster, stronger, alien. He knew he could not win. The noise reached Sarathia, and she arrived in a flash of white fire, her power illuminating the garden like a second sun. Her voice thundered across the marble walls. Enough! The assassins froze, bound in her telekinetic grip. She looked at them, her own subjects, and saw the madness in their eyes. He is a blight upon our purity. One spat. You bring ruin upon the light. Sarathia's expression was cold. Then let it be ruined. She crushed their weapons with a flick of her wrist. The air crackled, and in a burst of soundless energy they vanished, dissolved into dust that scattered across the dead flowers. Elias stared at her, breathing hard, the rod still clutched in his hands. They were your people, he said quietly. They were slaves to an illusion, she replied. As was I. He saw the pain in her face, not just anger but sorrow. She had turned against everything she had once believed in. As dawn approached, Sarathia stood before the plant again. Its stem had grown taller overnight, reaching toward the faint light above the clouds. She placed her hand over it, and for the first time in centuries, tears fell from her eyes. It lives because you believed it could, she said softly, and I nearly killed you for it. Elias smiled faintly. Hope's a stubborn thing. Doesn't care who believes in it, it just wants a chance. That night, Sarathia made a silent vow. She would no longer rule as the Queen of Light, but as the guardian of what little life remained. Her world had chosen death for too long. It was time to rebel against it. But rebellion, she knew, would not come without cost. The priests would not stop. The council would turn against her, and her empire, what was left of it, would soon demand her blood. Still, as she looked at the fragile green leaf swaying in the faint wind, she whispered, Let them come. I will not let hope die again. And far beyond the dying stars, something ancient stirred, something that had been waiting for those very words. The palace had become quiet again, but not in peace. The silence that followed the failed assassination felt heavier, filled with fear and suspicion. The servants moved through the corridors with lowered heads, whispering to one another about the human who had defied the priests and survived. Some believed Elias had bewitched the queen. Others thought he was the fulfillment of an old prophecy. Sarathia ignored their voices. She spent long hours beside the sprout in the garden, watching it grow. The air around it felt warmer now, as if the small patch of soil had remembered the meaning of warmth. She often found Elias nearby, tinkering with fragments of his ship, crafting tools, testing the air and soil with quiet patience. He looked fragile compared to her, yet there was something unshakable in his presence. When he spoke, it was without fear or reverence. When he looked at her, it was not as at a queen, but as at an equal. You have not left the palace in weeks, he said one day, as she stood by the garden's edge. They're talking about you. I know, she replied softly. They say I have turned against the gods. Elias wiped his hands on his worn uniform. Maybe your gods need someone to question them. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. My people will not accept that. Then they will have to learn, he said, or die clinging to the same light that's killing them. His bluntness shocked her, but also drew her closer to him. Humans had a strange kind of courage, one born not of strength but of refusal. They refused to bow to the impossible. They refused to surrender to silence. That night she stood before the Grand Council, her eyes blazing with resolve. The chamber was filled with the remaining lords of her empire, each wearing robes that shimmered with sacred light. Their expressions were cold and accusing. You have defied the decree of the eternal flame, the High Lord intoned. You have allowed a being of chaos to pollute our world. I have allowed life to return, Sarathia answered, her voice echoing through the hall. Blasphemy, another spat. The soil grows only because he has corrupted it. His presence is poison. Sarathia stepped forward, her aura flaring with restrained power. If it is poison that brings life, then perhaps our purity was the disease. Gasps filled the chamber. The council rose, their hands glowing as energy gathered. You are no longer fit to rule, the High Lord declared. By the law of Solren, we strip you of your throne. Sarathia stood unmoved. Then take it, she said quietly. But remember this, thrones cannot save a dying world. Only life can. With that, she turned and walked out. The guards hesitated, unsure whether to stop her. None dared. The air around her shimmered with raw power, and though her heart trembled, she did not show it. Elias was waiting near the garden when she returned. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes and the faint tremor in her hands. They turned on you, he said softly. They have been turning for a long time, she replied. He reached out and placed a hand on her arm. Then maybe it's time you stop ruling them and start saving them. She looked at him, her lips parting slightly. Save them? They would rather die than change. Then show them, he said, not with speeches, with life. He pointed toward the small sprout that now had grown into a fragile stem with glowing veins of green. You and I, this plant, prove that hope is possible here. Let them see it, she nodded slowly. If I do this, there will be war. Then let there be war, he said. Life has always had to fight for its place. The days that followed became the beginning of rebellion. Word spread through the outer colonies that the Barren Queen had made the dead soil bloom again. Some dismissed it as myth, but others, those who had lost everything, began to believe. Ships that had long drifted away from Ivra began to turn back, their captains carrying whispers of a miracle. Even among the priesthood, doubt began to spread. If life could return, then perhaps the gods had not abandoned them. Perhaps the gods were simply waiting for someone to defy them. Elias worked tirelessly beside Sarathia, helping her create more patches of living soil, mixing what little biological matter he had with the planet's crystal dust. It was a strange fusion of alien energy and human resilience. Each patch began to glow softly, spreading green light into the gray wasteland. At night, when the world fell silent, they would stand side by side watching the faint wind stir the young leaves. There were no words between them, only the quiet rhythm of two souls who had found meaning again in defiance. But their growing light did not go unnoticed. The high priest, furious and desperate, gathered the remaining loyalists. He declared that the queen had been possessed by a lower species and must be purged to restore divine order. Armies of radiant soldiers began to march toward the capital, their armor blazing with sacred fire. Elias stood atop the palace walls with a battered rifle from his ship, looking out at the approaching glow. That's not the kind of light you want to see coming, he said grimly. Sarathia stood beside him, her expression calm but resolute. They will destroy everything we have grown. Then we make them see what they're destroying, he said. We don't hide. We stand with it. Below them, the tiny fields of green pulsed softly, fragile yet unyielding. The winds carried their scent across the dying plains, a scent that reminded Sarathia of something she had almost forgotten. Hope. As the first lines of soldiers appeared on the horizon, Elias looked at her and smiled faintly. For someone who thought she was barren, you sure gave birth to a lot of trouble. A small laugh escaped her, quiet but real. Perhaps, she said, but this time I will not lose what has been born. The storm clouds above began to gather, thick and dark, swirling around the fading sun. Lightning danced across the sky, reflecting in Sarathia's eyes. She turned toward the horizon, her silver skin glowing with renewed strength. The rebellion of light and flesh had begun. The storm broke across the dying world like a scream. The air itself trembled under the clash of two lights, the sacred fire of the Solren army and the green glow of new life born from the soil. The horizon burned with lightning, and the palace walls shook as thunder rolled through the valley. Sarathia stood upon the high balcony, her silver robes whipping in the wind, her gaze fixed on the approaching army. Elias was beside her, gripping his rifle, his face hardened by resolve. Below them, the fields of reborn soil shimmered softly, trembling under the weight of the coming storm. They are too many, Elias said, scanning the horizon. They'll burn everything before they even reach us. Sarathia's voice was calm, but her eyes glowed with restrained fury. Then they will see what life fights like when it refuses to die. As the first wave of soldiers advanced, the air filled with radiant spears of energy. The ground cracked beneath their feet, glowing with molten light. But before the assault reached the palace, the earth itself responded. The green fields pulsed as if alive, and the sprouting vines coiled upward like serpents of light, wrapping around the incoming energy and consuming it. Elias stumbled back, astonished. "What is that?" "Life," Sarathia said softly, defending itself. The soldiers hesitated, their glowing armor reflecting the soft green light spreading beneath them. The ground pulsed with warmth, and for the first time in centuries, the dead planet felt alive again. Then came the high priest. He appeared at the head of the army, his form radiant, his staff crowned with white fire. His voice echoed across the battlefield. "Queen Sarathia has fallen into corruption. This human has infected her mind. Destroy them both and let the light be pure again." The soldiers roared in unison, their voices merging into a single wave of zeal. Elias looked toward Sarathia, sweat dripping down his face. "They're not going to stop." She turned to him slowly, her expression softening. "Neither are we." She stepped forward, her power surging outward in a wave of shimmering light. The palace windows shattered. Energy crackled in the air as her aura expanded, merging with the faint glow of the new plants. The entire garden blazed with green and silver fire. The two lights, divine and living, collided. The high priest screamed as the ground erupted beneath him. His followers fell to their knees, blinded by the surge. The vines of the new life reached toward them, not to kill but to cradle, to show them what they had forgotten. The light that once represented purity now flickered uncertainly, dimming before the pulse of rebirth. Elias ran down the marble steps into the chaos, firing his weapon to keep soldiers from reaching the queen. Each blast echoed like thunder. He moved not as a soldier but as a man fighting for something greater than survival, for meaning. The priest raised his staff, summoning a storm of sacred fire that split the air in two. The bolt struck the ground where Elias stood, throwing him backward. He hit the marble hard, the world spinning in a blur of smoke and green light. "Elias!" Sarathia's voice broke through the roar. She leapt from the balcony, her body surrounded by waves of luminous energy. She landed beside him, kneeling, her hand glowing as she pressed it against his wound. "You cannot die here," she whispered. His eyes opened weakly. "Then make sure I don't die for nothing." Rage and sorrow burned through her veins. She rose to her feet, lifting her hands toward the sky. The storm above seemed to listen. Lightning bent to her will, striking in perfect rhythm with her heartbeat. She turned her gaze upon the high priest. "You call yourself a servant of light," she said, her voice shaking the air itself. "But you forgot what light was for." He raised his staff in defiance. "Light is purity!" "No," she said, stepping forward, her aura expanding until it filled the sky. "Light is life." The storm exploded. Every crystal on the planet shattered at once, releasing the energy they had stored for centuries. The sacred fire of the Solrin merged with the reborn green glow. The entire world ignited, not in destruction but in creation. The soldiers fell to their knees, their armor dimming as vines of light wrapped around their arms, their chests, their faces. The high priest screamed as his own power turned inward, consuming the false purity that had blinded him. His staff dissolved into dust and his body became light, then faded into the soil. When the storm finally calmed, silence returned. But it was not the silence of death. It was the breathless stillness of something just beginning. Elias lay beneath the growing canopy, weak but alive. Around him the ground pulsed softly with warmth. Sarathia knelt beside him, her silver hair glowing faintly green from the energy she had unleashed. He looked at her and smiled faintly. "You did it." She shook her head slowly. "We did." He reached out, his hand trembling, brushing against her arm. "You saved your world." Her gaze softened. "No, you reminded it how to save itself." The winds shifted. The air was no longer sterile. From the once dead fields, thousands of new sprouts emerged, glowing with both human and Solrin essence, a fusion of two lights that had never existed before. In the weeks that followed, the skies began to clear. The violet storms faded, replaced by soft dawns that bathed the planet in gentle gold. The people of Solrin returned from exile, speechless at the sight of living fields where only dust had remained. They called it the dawn of two lights, the birth of a new age. Elias, still recovering, would often sit in the garden with Sarathia beside him, watching the new forests bloom. She no longer wore her crown. Her voice carried no command, only peace. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elias spoke quietly. "You think they'll remember?" Sarathia looked toward the horizon, her eyes glowing softly. "They will remember what it means to live." "That is enough," he smiled. "So, what happens to a queen when her world no longer needs saving?" She turned to him, a faint warmth in her expression. "She learns how to live too." And as the first true dawn in centuries spread across the sky, painting the land in colors no Solrin had ever seen, the barren queen and the fragile human sat beneath the new trees, silent, together as life reclaimed the world that had once forgotten what hope was.